The 19th of June is a unique holiday. For some, the date has been celebrated for as long as they can remember, but for others, it's practically unknown. This is partially because of the day's historical origins, which were much more important to African Americans than to many others. So let's talk about Juneteenth and why it's a day that everybody should keep in mind. Now, our journey begins with the sad, uncomfortable truth that when the United States began, slavery was still legal and in many parts of the country, common. Brutal and inhumane, it was also highly profitable, so the fight over slavery was political, social, and economic. From the moment the Constitution was ratified, the issue of slavery threatened to split the nation apart. These tensions finally boiled over in 1861 when a group of southern states formed a confederacy and attempted to violently break away from the United States, an action taken mostly to preserve their ability to keep slaves. The American Civil War followed, and to this day it remains the most deadly conflict our country has ever seen. At first, President Abraham Lincoln's goal was simply to stop the fighting. But when he realized that the war was going to continue, Lincoln decided that if he couldn't end the fighting, he would use the war to do what decades of political conflict had failed to accomplish. That is, end the practice of slavery. However, Lincoln's powers were limited. Slavery was written into the Constitution, and a president cannot simply rewrite it. Congress must vote to make the change permanent. But as the person in charge of the military, Lincoln could use wartime powers that he normally wouldn't have. Since nearly all of the states where slavery was legal had joined the Confederacy, and those states were at war, Lincoln could use wartime authority to seize the slaves away from the South, the way that the Army can seize property. Then he could use his authority to grant freedom to those slaves. This legal order was called the Emancipation Proclamation and was issued in September of 1862. However, the southern states refused to follow the order. After all, they were fighting the war to keep their slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation could only free slaves when the American Army, called the Union, took control of an area. Texas was one of the states that had slaves, but because it was so far out west, it was one of the last states the Union captured in the Civil War. In fact, despite the Emancipation Proclamation taking effect in January of 1863, it wasn't enforced in Texas until June 19th of 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and ordered the immediate emancipation of slaves throughout the state. Granger had 2,000 Union troops with him to help enforce that order. In 1866, on the one-year anniversary of this event, freed slaves gathered in Galveston to celebrate what they first called Jubilee Day. Soon, other nearby cities hosted celebrations as well. Over time, the popularity of the holiday fluctuated up and down, oftentimes hindered by segregation, which banned African Americans from celebrating in public parks. In Austin, a group of freed slaves actually bought their own 10-acre plot of land just so that they could continue to celebrate. By the Great Depression, more than 100,000 people would commonly celebrate the 19th of June in large cities such as Dallas. In 1938, the state's governor declared it a state holiday. By the 1950s, as black people moved from Texas to other parts of the country, they brought the holiday with them. Soon, Juneteenth jamborees were appearing all across America. For example, a 1978 celebration in Milwaukee attracted 100,000 people, despite the fact that the state of Wisconsin never even had legalized slavery. The next year, 1979, Texas passed legislation to make Juneteenth a paid state holiday. This was largely due to the work of many, such as State Senator Al Edwards, who recognized the importance of the milestone of emancipation for Black Americans, as well as for the fight for freedom and equality in this country. The holiday expanded rapidly throughout the 1980s, though it was much more well known in the African American community than in white communities. For many Black Americans, the holiday is a celebration of liberation, but also a way to recognize America's troubled relationship with racism and oppression. There are many white people for whom those issues were simply not as pressing or as personal, so for them the holiday didn't attract as much attention. In the 2000s, we have seen new urgency in calls for racial justice and equality. Because of this, Juneteenth is becoming more widely recognized by mainstream culture. There are now celebrations in every state across the country, even in far-flung cities like Honolulu, which wasn't even part of the United States until 1959, nearly a century after the Civil War ended. So this June 19th, I encourage you, find a way to celebrate liberation, emancipation, and the progress that America has made. But then, on June 20th, let's continue to fight to bring true racial equality.